Good afternoon, everybody. I'll have another go at starting. I've just managed to unmute myself. Good afternoon and welcome, everybody, to the third in the series of 4 webinars run by the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists around the practice placements and the college pre-registration eating, drinking and swallowing competencies. Today, I have the pleasure of presenting with my colleague Hannah Crawford, and we're going to be talking about signing off the competencies, which is more of a practical session, we hope. For those that don't know me, I am Judith Broll. I'm the Director of Professional Development at the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapy. I am a therapist by background. I used to run an acute speech and language therapy team and a community one later on in my career. I've also been a Royal College dysphagia advisor for far too long, and I've also run some post-basic dysphagia courses both nationally and internationally. So when I came into this role, I really understood the need for this work that we're doing, and it's going to really be profession changing once it all starts rolling out. So could I have the next slide, please? Just a little bit of housekeeping before we tell you about where we're going today. There are fantastic members of the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapy staff on hand to help with any technical issues. And if you can't access or you can't hear or whatever, please do contact them via the chat function. We're going to set that up just while people settle down, but then during the webinar, we will turn it off. And if you have any questions or any comments for either Hannah or myself, then please do put them in the Q&A, use that function, and then we can read them and respond at the end of this webinar. We are recording this webinar, and following its completion, we will be putting it on the website along with the others and the slides, so you can go back and maybe talk to them or come back to them with your team as and when is required. And then at the end, you will see an evaluation form pop up on your screen, and we do really listen to and appreciate any feedback that you would like to give us following completion of this webinar. So can we move on to what we're going to cover today? I think Hannah and I have been living and breathing this work for a very long time now, but I think it's really important just to sort of take a step back and put in context how we got to where we are here. Some of you who've been on our other webinars might have seen the slides. You can do some slide spotting, but I think it's important that you see this is all part of the whole. So that's why we're going to do a little bit of context setting. We're then going to talk a little bit about the historical challenges of signing off competencies, really from our experiences in the past, which I'm sure a lot of us on this webinar have had, how to actually make it this document we are anticipating is going to be clearer for you all and easier, I have to say. How these came about, how these competencies were put together. We're then going to really drill down to the granular level of what is the difference between an achieving or a developing or an achieved competence, and we'll come back to what that means when we get there. We're then going to talk a little bit about what we are asking clinicians to do as opposed to other ways that these competencies can be signed off. We know it is a big ask, a different cultural change for the profession, but actually we're sharing the responsibility, if you like, across many modalities, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then what this will do longer term is how we're going to be doing this and how it will actually land as a future-proofed way. Just wanted to say that this framework is going to be taught against in the curriculum for the students starting this September coming in 2021. So all the universities and HEIs have been working really closely with us for a wee while now and are very cited on these competencies. We anticipated that a lot of the content and the knowledge content that we were asking everybody to be mindful of was already embedded in many of the courses. So we are hoping that this is not a big new ask. It is something that should have been working against anyway, and we are just expanding on that and making it more cohesive across all 4 nations. The lead-in time will be is that we will start seeing competent speech and language therapists coming out by the latest 2026. Some courses will be quicker and they'll start coming out in 2024, depending on when the HEI start, the length of the course that those clinicians are on. It will give them a lead-in time, but the cut-off point is 2026, after which all therapists coming out will be competent at this level. I wonder if I could have the next slide. So we started this work really as a result of many things. We needed to do it because I think internationally we were charged with saying, do you know what, the UK is way beyond is an outlier with our MRA colleagues in what the competency level of around eating, drinking and swallowing is for our therapists coming out, and we needed to align with them to remain in the MRA. COVID hit and it shone a really bright light on the fact that speech and language therapists had such value, not only with communication, but also eating, drinking and swallowing with patients. But we needed more staff to be able to help support the specialist work, and there just weren't enough people there. And actually managers were coming to college going, can you help us train people really quickly? And HEE have been really cited on this work for a while and said, please, can we get this going? So they've given us a not insubstantial amount of money to make this happen and charging us to get on with it. We are aware we are in a pandemic. We're aware there is no good time to start this. And actually, it's that really difficult tension between saying we're in a pandemic, we can't ask clinicians to do more, but also clinicians we need them now to help us manage the pandemic. So I think as a collective, and we'll talk about that collective in a minute, decided we are going to keep going with it and get this going. And I think now we are all very pleased that we made that decision. So that the Health Education England has given us a pot of money. Half of that pot is to deliver this framework, and the other half is to look at the simulation piece around how to support delivering this framework. This money, although it comes from Health Education England, for which we're very grateful, we've made it very clear this is for the whole of the UK, for all devolved nations, so that at the end of it, which it doesn't matter where the clinician studies, they will have the same level of equity of understanding and competency when they are released into the world of being a speech and language therapist. So we worked, as we say, everywhere at pace, and we recruited a working group with a really transparent and robust process. We were amazed by the fabulous number of people applying for the job, and we got the working group, which we'll come back to in a minute, in place within October, November last year. Because the working group was going to have to cover all 4 nations, I was also really keen that if this is going to land, we needed an academic and a clinical. There were going to have to be 2 lead authors, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Hannah, who is the clinical lead author for that, but I'm going to double back on her in a minute if I may. There are then the other members of the working group, and there was 2 representatives from each of the 4 nations, really mindful that there are differences in the way things are delivered across the nations. So there were 2, can I just go to that slide now? I can always come back to this one. I want to show you who all these lovely people are. So we had this fabulous working group set up. We had 2 lead authors. We have Hannah Crawford, who is the lead Allied Health Professions and Social Work lead for Tees, Esk and Wear Valley NHS Trust, and the lead author and clinician and the lead speech and language therapist for them as well. And there's Paula Leslie, who is the other lead author, the academic lead author, who's a consultant scholar and a lot of experience both in teaching and delivering EDS. The English representatives were Kirsty Harrison, who's a senior lecturer at UEA, who was the academic rep, and Shifra Mulcairn, who is the clinical lead at Addenbrooke's, and she's the clinical lead there. The Scottish representatives, we have Carolyn Andrews, who is at Strathclyde, and the clinical lead is Kate Toft, who is in Lothian. And in Wales, we have Nicholas Demora Mizowski. I have been practicing that. Apologies, Nick, if you're listening. And he is our academic lead at Cardiff Met, and Nerys Williams, who is our clinical lead at Cardiff for Wales. And in Northern Ireland, we have Rosalind Rogers, who's the course lead at Ulster, and Orla McNulty, who is working as a clinical lead at the Western Health and Social Care Board, a clinical one. If we could just go back to the slide before. I think it's important to know who your reps are for each nation, and also to see that these are the people, I have to say, who worked extremely hard and extremely long hours to get these out, to get the first consultation out to all of you lovely members in January this year. And it was really important, not only that we managed to consult as widely as we could, and we had really good feedback and engagement from all the clinicians and HEIs around that. And then the competencies were published in February. We are now in the implementation phase of these, and I think what that has proven is that we are talking to universities, we're also talking to clinical groups, we're talking to groups who cover both. And I think that's really important. I'd like to say, if you'd like to invite us to come and talk to you and listen to you, we would be delighted. So please do that as an option. Could I please have the slide after that? We will wave at the working group. And I just think, just to put it in context of where these come from, is I wanted to make sure that everything was aligning with other important documents that will help support this landing right. So at about the same time, we reviewed the curriculum guidance, which will impact the EDS competencies, and the practice-based learning guidance was also published, which is another fabulous piece of work. The reason that these three are really the golden triangle of these documents is that they all speak to each other, they all reference each other's language. And I think this is not only EDS competencies is really important for the profession, but it is also an opportunity to think about expanding opportunities for placements. And that's something that we keep coming back to, is how can we do this? How can we do this? Actually, you can do it in a lot of settings that maybe historically hadn't been thought about, especially around the EDS the EDS agenda. So I'm just wanting to tell you that this was not done in isolation, and we did a lot of cross-matching and triangulation with a lot of other documents. Could I have the next slide, please? I think the thing is that, as we all know, professional learning has a lot of different elements to it. There is the knowledge, which is also part of our EDS competency. There is exposure to EDS dysphagia, and what we are really honing in on today is competencies within this framework. I think there is a knowledge section that we hope the HEIs are going to really focus on. But what we really want to talk about today is how the competencies are going to land and how we can actually measure them. I think we are looking for exposure to people with EDS. We are not saying that when you come out at the end of these competencies that any newly qualified therapist will be able to change a trachea or work on NICU, but that every clinician will have exposure to have seen adult and paediatric cases. And the paediatric piece really came, interestingly, from a lot of managers working with paediatric dysphagia, saying it's really hard to train and recruit staff because there's this scaredness of what is eating, drinking, swallowing with children. And actually we want to demystify it and to make sure that everybody knows what it is all about and what we are going to do. I think the last thing to say is that the level of competency that we are suggesting these students come out with, or these new grads are coming out with, will not be the same as the competency levels of the post-basic teaching courses that I know we all do at the moment, postgraduate. But what they will do is have a working knowledge and a useful working knowledge of how to manage, how to recognise, and indeed how to signpost eating, drinking and swallowing if needed. Could I have the next slide, please? Next one, thank you. I think it's just really important to think about this. We've had a lot of conversations about how we can, why are we focusing on eating, drinking and swallowing, and is it going to take away from communication? And that's why I wanted just to remind us, and it's useful for me as well to go back to think about it, that this is the mission statement for us as a profession, which is creating better lives for people with communication and swallowing needs. And what I would like to think that this framework does is to absolutely embed eating, drinking and swallowing not as something different, but to help the new recruits coming in to really think holistically about that patient or that service user. So if they had some dysphagia problems, not to be scared and run away from it, that they could look at that person in terms of communication and swallowing in the same session. And I think that really is a very valuable piece to move forward. And also we need to own dysphagia, eating, drinking and swallowing as a profession. We have been charged with being the lead profession in this area, and I think we need to own it right from the beginning of when new grads start being trained. Can I have the next slide, please? I'd be delighted now. I'm going to stop talking now, and I'd like to introduce you to Hannah Crawford, who is I've just talked about before, but I can't say enough how fabulous she is. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Hannah, to talk about your involvement and your thoughts. Thank you.
Hiya, thanks Judith, and thanks for inviting me to present today. It was a real honour to be working with that group of people to develop this piece of work, and something I feel really passionate about, not only as a kind of manager and employer, but as a dysphagia clinician myself. So I was really delighted to be involved. I am currently the professional head of speech and language therapy for Tees Escort and Wear Valley's NHS Trust, which is a large mental health and learning disability trust. Although my area of practice is with people with a learning disability. I have been a professional advisor for the RCSLT for many years in adult learning disability dysphagia, and have been involved in previous iterations of boards at college, what was the Professional Development and Standards Board. I'm currently in an acting role at Tees Escort and Wear Valleys, which is as lead for all allied health professions, social workers and peer workers. But at my heart, I'm a speech therapist. So we're just sort of here addressing some of the issues that have arisen from the meetings that we've had with HEIs and with clinicians, and from questions that have come through the consultation and through previous webinars. And signing off has been one of those things that has continued to recur. Sorry, Kaylee, could you just press the slide, move the slide on? Thank you. Has something that's come up, and something that we're happy to talk about. So I'll address these issues on the bullet in the bullet points, but they're not in any particular order, so I'll sort of talk around the slide. Sign off has always been a bit of a challenge, and previously I was involved in the previous set of eating, drinking, swallowing competencies for the profession. I think that was about 2016. And we recognise that one of the reasons they probably weren't embedded is that they weren't mandated. So we didn't tackle this issue of sign-off, and so actually I think they were used as a reference point, and actually the content of these new competencies and those of the old, they're not particularly different, but what we have done is clarify that sign-off issue. I think some of the things to sort of I don't know whether it comforts people, or just to put into context, when you are signing off, you're only signing off one very small component of those competencies, not the whole thing. And as we move through the slides, if you don't feel the learner is fully competent, you can sign off either at emerging or at achieved. Some of the competencies are transferable across communication and across eating, drinking and swallowing. So while there are some competencies which I, as a dysphagia clinician, feel you probably need to work regularly with eating, drinking, swallowing presentations, you probably do need to be working in that arena to sign them off. Others, not necessarily. I think you don't necessarily need to be dysphagia qualified to know that a learner has had a really good conversation with a service user or with their family about what's important to them about eating and drinking. And, you know, for example, I currently have a therapist who works in liaison and diversion in police stations, but she's a dysphagia qualified speech and language therapist. And, you know, there may be times when she would be able to sign off competencies, even though she's not currently working in that area. Our CAMS clinicians don't currently work with a lot of children, primarily with their eating and drinking presentations, but they will go into schools and they will have good relationships with those children and with their families. So it may be appropriate that they can support a learner, for example, to sit with a child at lunchtime or to talk with kitchen staff about eating, drinking and swallowing. So we want to build as much flexibility into both the achievement of the competencies and the knowledge and the exposure. And I think something that's really important is not necessarily to equate competency with exposure. You need some exposure to develop competency, but some of the competencies can be developed in university settings. So I think, you know, there's obviously a relationship with those, but we also need learners to see people with eating, drinking, swallowing problems in different settings. So the competencies and the exposure are two actually different things. But there are lots of settings where people eat and drink, so it's not just thinking about dysphagia placements. So many placements have places where people eat. So people eat in prisons, people eat at school, people eat at day centres. So it's about thinking about how we can be creative with those opportunities, and we will look at what some of those competencies are and where you know that you might get exposure to some of those experiences in the clinical setting. I think there are a few settings that might be challenging, and I acknowledge that some settings will provide exposure more easily than others. And one of the settings that I thought might be particularly challenging would be therapists who are working independently, maybe only with children with communication difficulties, maybe seeing those children in a clinic setting in the therapist's home. It might be difficult to access eating and drinking experiences. But it's really important to also remember that this exposure is gathered across the whole of the learner's journey. So the learners have 3 years to develop, to achieve these hours. The other thing to think about is there have been settings that people feel are maybe challenging for students to gain exposure because of the speciality of the setting, but actually it may be really relevant for a student to come and do some observation, for example, in ITU or you know, with neonates, not actually taking any responsibility in there, but doing some observation and getting some exposure. And that will allow those people to take students where previously maybe the speciality of what they did prevented them from being able to take students in the past. Okay, so in terms of an overview of the competencies, we have 20 competencies, but in order to be considered competent at entry level, we are recommending that learners need to be signed off for at least 16 of those competencies. And they are designed to be binary, so to try and help support that sign off. And I'll come to that in a little bit. It's really, really important to remember that learners are not graduating with specialist knowledge and skills. They're graduating with entry-level knowledge and skills, which brings them in line with communication. So you wouldn't expect them to be an expert in AAC. You wouldn't expect them to have a real level of expertise in autism. It's the same with the dysphagia competencies. It's a starting point that we can then build on as employers. So there will still be a role for the post-registration training, but for us, who in our service we offer an in-house competency development program, it'll be a little bit more bespoke and a little bit more tailored to what the individual learner brings with them to the workplace. But those NQPs will still require the same support and supervision for communication as they do for dysphagia, but it will bring dysphagia in line with communication. There've been quite a lot of questions about how do I know that it's good? How do I know it's good enough? And we have tried to avoid the temptation to write a list of what looks good, because then that becomes prescriptive, and then we don't want people to be restricted by those examples. And I think the message we're trying to give is that bring it in line with your expectations in terms of communication. We wouldn't write a list of what we expect in terms of competencies and communication for our learners, but also we're working with a professional workforce and a workforce where our kind of autonomy and the trust in our colleagues is one of our core values. We trust the workforce to know what's good. And I think the other advice we'd give you is discuss with your team, have those discussions with the student. And when we move into some of the examples, I can give you some ideas about what I think would be kind of emerging and what I think would be achieved. But I think we'll know it when we see it. And I'm sorry if that doesn't sound more prescriptive, but we've really avoided trying to be prescriptive about this. But the other thing to say is that signing off a student as competent in one area doesn't mean that you're responsible or we're responsible for the competence for the rest of their career. They need to be good enough to enter the workforce as an NQP, and employers will monitor that, supervisors will support, will develop, you know, continuous professional development around these areas. So, you know, we will be looking at post basics, we will be looking at in-house qualifications, and we will be working with our NQPs to decide what it is that they need in line with their communication work. And I think there's an element of wanting to demystify dysphagia or eating, drinking, swallowing, and look at it as a linear progression. So one of my members of staff, we've been talking about this the other day, had been told at college that every mealtime you're dicing with death. I think that kind of puts the fear of God into our students, and that's not where we want to be. Eating, drinking, swallowing dysphagia, it's a continuum. There are links with eating, drinking and communication. We know about this anatomy and neurology from our training, and actually, you know, that's not necessarily the reality of every workplace, but that really specialist end of it is where our learners will be moving in a much more linear rather than a kind of step progression of nothing at undergraduate and then having to do a post basic and then having to develop. We're wanting to make that learning much more developmental and continuous. Next slide, please, Kaylee. So just looking around some examples of these competencies, and so for example, one of the first ones is discussing the importance of eating, drinking, swallowing and the service user's goals with the service. Now, this isn't one that you would necessarily need to be, you know, practicing all the time in dysphagia to recognise that the student had done a good job having that conversation. But for example, something that I might talk around with a student is they may have done some discussion about eating and drinking, swallowing with the service user. They may have forgotten to bring in a partner or a spouse or a sibling who might have been at that discussion. They might have talked around what would you like, but not firmed up to some clear goals. And I would consider that developing, and I'd have that conversation with the student to say, you know, it was really obvious that actually that person's wife wanted to come in and say something there. And, you know, I might have found a way to facilitate that discussion between the three of them. So next time that's something to think about. Or they talked about some long-term aspirations, but it might have been really useful to help, you know, pin down 2 or 3, you know, measurable, achievable, specific goals that you're going to focus on in the next, you know, 3 months. And so, but if the student had done that on first kind of discussion, then I would consider that achieved. If there wasn't anything else that I wasn't going to pick up on that discussion, then I would consider that achieved. So they're the type of examples, and I think if you see that immediately on your placement, then you can go straight to signing that off as one example of achieved. And you can see in terms of that signing off of competence, it may be that you see that 2 or 3 times in a placement, so you can sign it off twice. It may be that someone already signed off one and you're signing off at the next placement, or, you know, a placement a year along the line. This document will develop over the 3 years that the student is learning. Next slide, please, Kaylee. So just some examples. I don't know if you can see that, if it's big enough, but all these examples are available in the document online. And we have highlighted some that we feel have to be done face-to-face. We've highlighted some that we think generally they should be done face-to-face, and others, for example, probably can't be done face-to-face. So things like obtaining background information from Kate's notes is not required as face-to-face. So just looking around, kind of tallying that exposure with competencies. Some of them, you know, will all count towards the hours, but some of them don't necessarily need to be patient-facing, so could be done more remotely. But I would suggest that you have a look at that document online if you haven't already. They are the 20 competencies that need to be achieved, and there needs to be 16 out of 20 of those ticked off. So I will hand you back to Judith.
Thank you, Hannah. Could I have my next slide, please? I think however much guidance we give, just going back to what you were saying just now, Hannah, reflecting what you were saying, is we are trying to get this really tight balance with trying to be as clear as we can be, that hits HEIs and clinicians, and it can land with both groups and they both understand it. But if we get too prescriptive, I think it will just become too difficult, or if we start listing, it will be a list with exclusions, and there's also always going to be bits that we will miss. And I think as a professional group, we trust you as eminently wise clinicians to be able to make decisions about these things as well. And that's why we're working in partnership. That's why it is so important we keep talking to each other, because if there are things that really we are hearing again and again and again that need clarification, that's why we, as a professional group, and we'll go back to the working group as well, and to go out to the whole profession and say, well, what should we do about this? This is a piece of work that is evolving. So I think that's why we are very loath to be any clearer about what is meant to be going on. But I think, as Hannah said, it's up to you really to make that final choice, and we're absolutely comfortable with that. I think one question we have been asked quite a lot of times is, so universities and clinicians and us at college and everybody, we're working extremely hard to make this change. What are we going to see that is different? What's the purpose of it? We're all doing this work, we're running around. What are we going to see differently in the students and then the NQPs that come out the other end? I think what we're doing, and we are going to probably get it out to in the next week or two, is to really clarify carefully what it is we are expecting, the expectations of these new grads to have when they come out at the end. I think that the headline, and do chip in, Hannah, if you think this is different, is that these are clinicians who will have had exposure to eating, drinking and swallowing. They will be demystified by it and will also be useful when they come out and hit the ground. They will be able to go, if they're in an acute unit, and do a simple review. Could I go back a slide, please? And also they will be able to signpost if there is a problem. So I think it's about thinking about what it is you need for your clinicians to do. And also we know that all NQPs will still require supervision and support. They will still need to have the NQP framework around them, the competency framework. We're working really closely with HE in England anyway around preceptorships to see how we can support NQPs coming through with this. And I think as well, it's about what Hannah said earlier, is about every service will need to have something different. So I think what we want is to give every clinician to have that experience, to come out with an understood baseline on which to grow your individual clinician. And it is a continuum of learning, which I will come back to, I think, on my next slide, if I remember. Please, Kaylee. What we have done is, I think, as we've seen here today, a definition of what counts as an hour in EDS exposure. And that's already on the website, as is that the document that Hannah referenced just now is the competencies which need to be delivered face to face. And I think that is a really useful delineation, because then it will really help us with the next piece of work we need to do at college, which is to look at simulation, because maybe quite a lot of those other competencies could be done through sim or with HEIs, or they could be done in clinical practice depending on where you are, but that's not the aim of them per se. The endpoint expectations document is due out shortly. And after really useful discussions with HEIs and clinical practice educators, we are working to investigate how we can put together a log of some description to make it as high-tech or as low-tech as you like, to log the hours. We had a previous webinar where we talked about the hours in more detail. And if you'd like more details about what those hours look like, both adult and pediatric, please, I would suggest you go back and have a look at that. But I think if we can have a robust tool to actually how those hours are logged and how they're evidenced, that's a fabulous thing for newly qualified to take to any interview or to a new role, so that everybody knows where they are, what they need to do, and a starting point. Because there's so much work to be done, especially around that and other things and the sim work, we're recruiting a project coordinator to help us. If you know of anybody who would like to come and join us, the job advert for that's just my little punt, is going out shortly. Next slide, please. And I think it's going back to that last point about the continuum of learning. We are reviewing as a professional body with a lot of other people and our AHP colleagues, the whole career pathway for speech and language therapists, thinking about opportunities for working with eating, drinking and swallowing, and communication, and research, and clinical educators, and other options going into leadership or to stay as a consultant and ACP. So we're doing a huge piece of work looking at the whole career pathway, of which EDS is part. And then next year, when we have quite recovered from starting to embed this piece of work, because we have really moved the goalposts of where the training for speech and language therapists starts around eating, drinking and swallowing, we've moved the goalpost into pre-registration training. We are then going to have to think about the rest of the current college dysphagia training and competency framework that Hannah spoke about before. It was due to have a revision anyway in 2017, and that didn't happen. So this is now a fabulous opportunity to think about how we can start looking at our ongoing career development training in dysphagia EDS, looking at the work that's already been done. The post-basic, I don't think will be fit for purpose because a lot of it may well be covered in this work. But then, so what opportunity did that offer up to what we can do in the new world, if you like? I think it needs to align to all the 4 pillars, which will then allow to think about career pathways, and also to encompass specific areas, for example, tracheostomies and NICU and video fluoroscopy and all the other myriad of specialist areas that we are working in as a profession. But I'd like to think about pulling that together in a postgraduate format, which makes life more robust. And maybe there will be some training packages we can have for everybody to be supported against. Next slide, please. Just this is, I think you may have seen this before, but if you wanted more information around the competencies, and what I would really ask you and your colleagues is to share it as widely as possible. We think we have gone out as widely as we can in all our different modalities, but we are really aware that really busy clinicians, this might not have landed with them. So one ask from us to all of you is please do share it, spread the love, spread the joy, and start thinking about it now. I've had a lot of discussions with some clinicians recently who are already engaged with it and interested in coming up with the most fabulous examples of how they might develop it locally. And it's a really good opportunity. I know a lot of places have really good, strong relationships between universities and clinicians, but I would suggest this is another chance to go back and really see how you can do this. It's not, we're not asking HEIs to do it, we're not asking clinicians to do it, we're asking all of us to do it. And therefore, I think if we can work out how we're going to share the load, I think that would be really good. There are some YouTube videos. The one I think will be really good for you all to have a look at, if I might suggest, is the one from Beverly Harden, who is the AHP lead at Health Education England. I think this is just to show that it's not just an RCSLT initiative, but we have the supporting and backing of Health Education England, and it's quite a good watch and quite quick. We have one more webinar, which I will come back to in a minute. And this is a registration link if you'd like to join us next Thursday. And then all these webinars, you can go back and have another look at. They'll be on our website shortly. And actually, it's quite good to go back, maybe think about working as a team and looking at it and mulling over how that might be able to do. We've already put together some frequently asked questions, some FAQs. That will be an iterative process, and we will keep asking and reviewing those as we go along. So please do have a look at those. Next slide, please. And our final webinar in this series is around opportunities for paediatric practice placements around EDS, which is this time next week on the 8th of July. And we'd be really grateful for you to attend if you find that useful and interesting. Now, I just wonder, while we have been talking, how many questions there have been. I have to say I can't.
I've been having a look, Judith, and I've answered some, hopefully adequately by just typing responses, but I picked up a couple to address verbally. The first one is from Neil, who's asking whether we're suggesting that communication difficulties should have their eating, drinking, swallowing observed, discussed in mainstream, even when this has nothing to do with what they've been referred to the service for. No, we're not suggesting that. What we are suggesting is that in that setting, there may be children who do have eating, drinking, swallowing difficulties, who may previously have been known to speech and language therapy and have recommendations in place, and who speech and language therapy have an existing good relationship with, and with consent and discussion with both the child and the family, they may be happy for the speech therapist, the student, to sit with them and just understand how that difficulty is being managed, to understand how, you know, what's important about eating and drinking to that child. We wouldn't suggest that anybody did that without consent and without collaboration with the families and with the child themselves, but that there may be opportunities to do that. That's what we're suggesting, but we really wouldn't suggest that anything happened without the consent of the family and the child and just for the purpose of learning. So I hope that clarifies that question. Nick's asking, he did a postgraduate course. Is this something we'd still expect? Not necessarily expect. We expect that the postgraduate, post-basic dysphagia courses will still be there, and that might be the right fit for some NQPs, but not actually mandated now. And it's looking at that learning profile and what knowledge, skills, experience and exposure the learner feels they had, and what the manager, supervisors feel that individual requires in practice, but just that we know that everybody is entering the workforce with the same kind of baseline requirement. I think looking at Jenny's comment is that lots of final year students come on placement have very little dysphagia experience. I think we appreciate that, and this is a journey, and actually probably, Jenny, the students you may be receiving, it won't be the same in the future as these this framework is embedded within practice. I think, you know, we in the service that I manage, so far students have come and they see a lot of dysphagia. I don't think we're going to struggle to give them the full set of hours, which isn't necessarily ideal, because you want students to see a variety of settings and be exposed to a variety of settings, but currently we can't accredit the student with those hours. Towards what we suggest is keep a log of them, because it'll be useful to show people at interview that that's what you've done, but we can't credit them that. So I think, you know, there are a lot of students who probably have had dysphagia exposure but aren't currently logging that. And I think also sometimes even with our NQPs now, and we do a lot of our dysphagia competency knowledge and competency development through a range of mechanisms in our setting. So we have a dysphagia CPD session that runs 4 times a year, but we still sometimes have to tell our new NQPs, in this session you are learning about, so that they can build their kind of competency portfolio, you know, which sort of parallels post-basic work. So I think it's just having as this piece of work develops, and as we get students starting on the programme, hopefully we'll see them coming with more experience and being able to sort of integrate that knowledge into what they're doing. But the bottom line is that actually we have to start this somewhere, and they will need to have achieved the hours to graduate. Now, those hours are not in addition to the communication hours. They're forming part of those communication, the full kind of requirement of students. And say, for example, you go to see somebody who has dysphagia and communication issues, then you can double count those hours. You can spend that time saying you've seen that communication, but you've also spent an hour talking about dysphagia. So we're trying to make this as manageable as possible, but given kind of our mission statement from RCSLT, it's really important that we start giving some level of parity to eating, drinking, swallowing exposure for learners as we do for communication. And I'm looking at Jenny's responses that we wouldn't expect you to give them all the hours at the moment. It may be that in one setting, on one placement from one organisation, you can give them 2 or 3 hours. Another, you know, we've had a student very recently who spent 4 days with 2 clinicians, 4 days for 6 weeks with 2 clinicians. So basically 2 days a week with 1 clinician for 6 weeks, and all she's seen in that half of the placement is dysphagia. So there will be other placements where they can pick this stuff up, and we are looking at the simulation piece of work. I can see the NB from BCU's talking about a dysphagia simulation, Janet, that takes students 6 to 7 hours. So that's, you know, that's a good chunk of the experience. Sorry, I'm now reading these questions on the hoof, Judith. I don't know if you want to come into any of that. It's expected when NQPs start work, they will map their competencies against the RCSLT postgrad, so may have 2 sets of competencies running, or will the project take this into account? I would say that we move over to the new. We may have an overlap period where you've got students who are halfway through, but Judith, you can correct me on the dates because you've got them. I think it's got to be fully working by 2024. It may be that some universities go earlier, and we have got some pilot sites where they're starting. And in our trust, we've agreed that we're going to start piloting the competency and hours tools so that we can go back to the HEIs we work with to say, look, if you've started this is how much they've got. If you haven't, this is this kind of straw poll of how much they would get with us, how much they do get with us, and what competencies we've been able to tick off, just so that we can start that dialogue, really. I can't work out if they're coming top down or from the bottom now.
Thank you, Hannah. While you work out whether they're coming in or outing, I'm also fighting the system here. Just going back to what you were saying, Anita, because this is a new initiative, we are very mindful, and actually something I meant to say earlier is that we wrote this framework was written with consultation from a very wide group, and it is linked in with so many other documents, including the SOPs from HCPC and the curriculum guidance and everything else. But another document we used and was very helpful is from the Generosity from the Republic of Ireland, and their document. They did exactly this piece of work in about 10 years ago. And I think learning from them has been extremely valuable. And absolutely, they said it because it's a new way of working, there will be some overlaps, and there may be some mop-ups, and there may be some people who we have to have this slightly dissonant issue at the moment with, are they doing the postgraduate or are they doing the pre-reg or whatever, but we need to work that out as we go along. But that's why I want to start the review of the current curriculum guide and the dysphagia competency framework next year, in January next year, so that there won't be too much of an overlap and there won't be too many students stuck in this sort of interim phase. But I think, again, that's why we all need to work together. It's an iterative process. We're all being very flexible with the way we work, and I think that's something that we need to work on. And if that's something you want to talk about in a bit more detail, I'd be really happy to have that chat with you outside this webinar. But I think you're right, we need to all just work together. There's a question here about where will the hours be signed off? Is the student or practice educator, is it the student or practice educator that would document the hours? I think the idea is that the student would hold it, but would have access, but the HEIs and clinicians would have access to it. That's what we're working on in this document that will be open. And we've been talking about all sorts of apps and ways that we can look at it. We're seeing how we can align it with the RCSLT CPD diary, because I think that would be really valuable to then sort of feed into that. But because we want to get something up and running quite quickly, we might have to have a bolt-on system first before we can really integrate it into the CPD diary. But ultimately, the opportunity is to subsume the whole of this competency framework within business as usual with all competencies. And so either we take out all this competency logging, or we think about whether there's other areas that we'd like to think about in the same way. But at the moment, I think it's important for us just to start somewhere as a line in the sand. Hannah is madly typing, and I'm
I'm just looking at Neil's comment about and I think it's really interesting. It's sort of displaying that desire to think about what can be done. So he's saying that our setting could probably give each student a few hours, but that would mean sending all the students through the small number of dysphagia SLTs, which I don't think they'd be happy with. It means they couldn't have a student for a full placement. Around 20 to 30 students pushed through the 5 dysphagia SLTs per year, and I was immediately wowed by the 20 to 30 students. So that's brilliant capacity. And yeah, I think you're right, Neil, it's not necessarily, you possibly couldn't send all those students through those 5 dysphagia SLTs, but kind of doing what you can and sharing that responsibility out through your local geographies. And there's many different services offering placements to those students. And I think, but also that idea and that what we're trying to think about in our service and what we're being pushed to do as a result of COVID is, what other opportunities can we offer to students? Where can we double up with students, or even have more than that? So some of the things I'd started to type and then delete, what other opportunities, CPD sessions, journal clubs, is it possible to have a service user come and talk about their lived experience of dysphagia, which maybe could be done in a webinar framework with all 30 students there, all of them getting an hour with Q&A. It may be that actually those dysphagia clinicians don't take any full-time students, but the agreement is they'll each offer an hour to 5 students over the course of the year. And actually, we're talking about how we maybe offer kind of rotational placements where the student might have one supervisor, but they spend time with other people. And in these remote settings, we have these remote times, we have some speech therapists who are ward-based, and some speech therapists, community therapists who are offering much more remote therapy currently through things like Attend Anywhere. And actually, if we tried to give the students to all those ward-based therapists, they'd be absolutely overrun. So saying to the ward-based therapists, actually, you're not going to be the supervisor of the students. They'll be supervised with those clinicians who are working more remotely, although we are returning a little bit to base, but actually they'll get some of the face-to-face time from those ward therapists, but they won't be responsible for all the other admin of the students and for doing the supervisions of the students, but they'll do some of that face-to-face exposure.
Thank you. I think what I'm seeing in the chat is about people. So Rachel's talking about local speech and language therapy services linking with HEIs, and that pleases me enormously. I think this is an opportunity to really have a really closer dialogue. I know there are some really good evidences of that, but I think that's something that we would really like to get going a bit more. And we are suggesting we set up some communities of practice, which are basically places for people to go and just talk through the challenges. We are absolutely clear, eyes open. It is going to have different challenges for different different people, but we don't want anyone to feel they're alone with it, is exactly what Neil's saying, and what Hannah's suggesting is we need to start doing a bit of group think about this. I think I would suggest that if we can all do it together and learn from each other, I think this is really important. And I think if we can set those up, then that would be really helpful, and I'd love to sort of join them just to understand more. There's also quite a lot in the chat about how can we get these documents out. We will go back and have a look at the web access, but in the meantime we will send out all the documents we've referenced on the back of this webinar to you all, so you will have them and you will have sight of them. And I like them in Word form because I'm old and I can't do technology, but I think they're quite accessible for people that way. But if the links aren't working, apologies, but we should hopefully send out all these documents again to you at the end of this webinar, if that is good. I'm just wondering what else there is coming out.
While I was typing, did you answer Amy's query, Judith, about where will the hours be signed off? Is it the student or practice educator?
Yeah, I've signed that one off. Yeah. I'm aware of time. I think there's a comment here from Paula about the fact that we've tried to make these competencies as accessible to all clinicians as possible, and that's something really interesting that we haven't called them their dysphagia competencies. We've called them eating, drinking and swallowing competencies, to think about the widest possible access and exposure. So it isn't, and I'm using the words of Paula Leslie, who was the academic lead author, it's not the widget in your throat, it's the bigger piece. It's the bigger piece of the whole thing. So it's how that impacts, the eating, drinking and swallowing issue impacts on that service user and their families and everybody around them and the multidisciplinary team, which then I hope would give scope to us as clinicians to think about eating, drinking and swallowing in its widest sense. That's why we don't have to have all the competencies signed off by a dysphagia specialist. It could be anybody who is trained in being a speech and language therapist. And I think that's something that hopefully gives wider scope and access to potential supervisor pool on the ground, and also to an access to who these people are that we can sign off against. So you don't have to have a patient labelled with a nasogastric tube as a dysphagia patient. It could be somebody who has a lifelong challenge with eating, drinking and swallowing, and that service user, it's their everyday life, but that's a really good lived experience for a learner to think about. So it's thinking about as wide and as generic as possible, rather than very narrow and is their epiglottis inverting. This is the biggest, widest focus.
Yeah, and I think just that maybe answers Granya's question. I can see in the chat about what requirements, who can be a supervisor and what level experience. We really aren't delineating like that. I think it's looking at what you're working on with your student. I mean, my plan would be to take that, the competency sign-off stuff, have a look at the end of the day and say, okay, let's see what we've done today, and let's have a look at, reflect on what you've done within that, and we'll discuss together whether we think that's an emerging skill or whether we think you've achieved that. And I think depending on what you've exposed that student to and what you've been responsible for supervising and supporting them in, then if that fits within those competencies, then you're experienced enough to sign that off. In the same way as you'd be signing stuff off for communication. And really important to remember, this is entry level. This is people who are good enough to start their work as NQPs, working both in communication and swallowing, with the same level of support you would be giving them for communication.
Thank you, Hannah. That is a fabulous line it's a lovely strap line to finish with. I was always looking for a good one. I'm going to bring this webinar to a close, if I may. I wanted to thank Hannah for all your hard work, thinking, wise words and enthusiasm today. And thank you all for listening and for offering up such interesting communication points and conversation points. We are hoping that this is the beginning of a communication between you all, and I'm absolutely clear, please spread the word as wide as you can, and please ask us if you'd like us to come and talk to your group locally. Really, really useful indeed. We'd love to do that, and this is going to be the beginning of more communications all round. So thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you so much, team at college, for your support in this area, and thank you all of you for attending today, and we look forward to continuing working with you, and thank you so much.